Hey there! Make sure to stick around until the end of the video for part 3 of a 4-part series sponsored by Squarespace. Start your free Squarespace trial today at squarespace.com/browntable and use code BROWNTABLE to get 10% off your first purchase.
You knocked down a building?
It was on fire, structurally unsound. It was coming down anyway.
Tell me you haven't been listening to the police scanner again.
Look, I performed a public service. You act like that's a bad thing.
It is a bad thing, Bob. Uprooting our family again so you can relive the glory days is a very bad thing.
Reliving the glory days is better than acting like they didn't happen.
Yes, they happened. But this, our family, is what's happening now, Bob. And you are missing this.
Things haven't spiraled out of control the moment I left.
Amazing as it may seem, it has been quite uneventful, in fact. How about you?
I saved a runaway train! It was so great!
2018 had a plethora of sequels. We had Infinity War,
I don't feel so good.
Ant-Man and the Wasp, Deadpool 2, Mission Impossible Fallout, Jurassic Park 5, and many more. And animated movies also took a plunge with Johnny Depp's greatest film, Sherlock Gnomes. There was also Hotel Transylvania 3, and now Incredibles 2 and Ralph Breaks the Internet. This isn't to say that there haven't been a multitude of original films this year, but in this video we're going to be focusing on sequels and how a sequel can be good and bad. Even more specifically, we're going to be talking about The Incredibles 2, directed by Brad Bird, and Ralph Breaks the Internet, directed by Rich Moore and Phil Johnston. See, a sequel has to do a number of things to not only be as good as the first, but hopefully better. The main problem with crafting a sequel is that characters have already finished their character arcs from the first movie. Let me explain. To make a plot-driven film at least competent, you need an interesting, dynamic character that changes over time due to the consequences of decisions they've made that are based on or directly related to circumstances that are out of their control. To put it simply, characters change due to the story. When a film is said and done, everything needs to be wrapped up without too many loose ends, because if not, then the audience will feel cheated. Side note, this is something that happens a lot in movies that are set in a cinematic universe. There's a lot of plot that goes unanswered, and the audience is forced to wait for the sequel. So if a movie ends, and let's say the film's characters change for the better, then when making a sequel, where can these characters go? If a character is grown, forcing them back to being a flawed character doesn't really work because it negates the purpose of the first film. Reiterating the point of the first film, just in a lazier way, is to me the worst thing a sequel can do. And that's the main problem with The Incredibles 2. You know, The Incredibles is one of the best animated films ever made, one of the best superhero films ever made, and to have a sequel that's so sloppily written is kind of weird, especially considering Brad Bird is a fantastic filmmaker and he knows what makes a movie work. And here to help me talk about why The Incredibles 2 may be a good movie but not a really good sequel is Houston from HoustonProductions1. Say hi, please.
Hey, thanks to Browntable for having me on. Just to preface, I am sick right now, which is why my voice sounds like I am a little old man under a bridge. And also, it will crack a lot. Alright, so look, I know this is gonna be a really hot take, because by all accounts, a lot of people enjoyed Incredibles 2. It got good reviews, everyone I know in real life has said they liked it, and you know what? On the first viewing, I liked it too. It was pretty fun, and it still has some entertaining moments, great animation, and awesome action. But at the end of the day, after several months to think on it, I gotta face the truth here. Incredibles 2 is a pretty mediocre movie and a really bad sequel, and today I'm gonna talk about why. That's right, Browntable is giving me my big shot featured guest appearance, and I'm using it to make you all hate me. I'm sorry, everyone! Over on my YouTube channel, I tend to focus more on things I like, but seeing as this is a collab, I'm gonna branch out a bit. My biggest problem with Incredibles 2 is that it's ultimately a step backward for the storytelling depth, creativity, and even the maturity of the world and characters of the first movie. And that's why it's a bad sequel. A good sequel takes the world and characters of the original installment and expands upon them, adding more depth and more creativity, and in many cases, more maturity. Sequels like The Empire Strikes Back, The Dark Knight, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, underrated, all do this. Or, if you want to get animated, Toy Story 2, Kung Fu Panda 2, Shrek 2, and How to Train Your Dragon 2 do the same thing. These are sequels that maintain and remember what made the original film so great in the first place, while also evolving the concept and characters in a way that feels organic and avoids retreading the same ground. To be sure, it's a tough line to walk, but there have been many films to do it. All of this to say, Incredibles 2 is a textbook example of not that. Incredibles 2 is ultimately extremely regressive in every one of the areas that a good sequel should be progressive. And here's the thing, I get it. The Incredibles is a modern classic animated movie, and one that many, including myself, have very high regard for and fond memories of. It would be really hard for a sequel to completely top the first movie, especially after 14 years of anticipation. But going into Incredibles 2, I didn't expect it to top the first movie. All I wanted it to do was what any good sequel should do: maintain the elements that made the original so great while also going in a fresh direction. Unfortunately, it does neither of those things. Instead of putting our characters into new situations and having them go through new character arcs, the film goes out of its way to repeat the arcs from the first movie beat for beat and simplify previously complex heroes. It's pretty crazy that this story is set 3 months after the original, and yet every character seems to have forgotten everything they learned just weeks ago. Don't believe they're repeating the character arcs? The movie literally wipes the memory of Tony so that Violet can have the same arc from the first film and learn to be confident and talk to a boy. Again, this doesn't even make any sense. Violet's arc in the first movie is about learning to be confident in her own personality and abilities and not be defined by what a boy thinks of her. That was how she changed. But in this, her insecurity is like the driving force of her character. What happened? Was the first movie erased from her memory too? Then we've got the character of Dash, who was a reasonably complex kid in the previous installment. In the first Incredibles, Dash is a 4th grader who knows he's special and has abilities no one else has, who is being forced to repress those abilities for the sake of fitting in. This causes him, as many kids would, to act out in class and beg to join the track team and constantly vie for his parents' attention, all because he's not being able to truly express who he is. He's not allowed to be who he is or compete in the track competitions because it would be unfair to the other kids who don't have superpowers. The Incredibles comes to the conclusion that it's okay to use your gifts and be who you are and even be better than other people at some things, as long as it's not just about the glory. A world where everyone's a winner crushes true exceptionalism. And the best part? Dash's character ties into that theme just as much as Syndrome and Bob and Helen and Violet do. Hard cut to Incredibles 2. A kid with an understandable motivation and character that relates to the theme like Dash in the first film, in this movie is completely one-dimensional and relegated to the comedic relief. And by comedic relief, I really mean obnoxiously screaming every line at the top of his lungs.
Violet! Who wanted all vegetables? We want to fight bad guys. It's got a big yard! Wow! Dodge the bug! So uncool! Wow! No way! There! Max power! Wait! Let's go! Holy cow! No! Darn it! Mom and Dad! Dash been underwater for too long!
Dash has no character here. He has no arc. He just wants to get his math homework done. That's his entire motivation. So, 2 of our interesting kid heroes from the first movie in this film have either been forced to repeat the same arc from the original, or have been regressed so much that they don't even have a character at all.
One thing that's surprising about the movie is that nothing really happens. If you think about it, at the end of the first Incredibles, the heroes are suiting up, the Parr family. They're gonna go take down the Underminer, and it seems like superheroes are now allowed, especially since the Incredibles took down Syndrome's robot in the first movie. And it seems like all is great and superheroes are legal now. Even in the first movie, it's kind of teased.
No school like the old school. Just like old times.
But like Houston stated, the sequel regresses pretty much everything. So actually no, superheroes are still not legal, and at the end of the movie, The Incredibles 2, they are legal now, but since it kind of felt like that already happened in the first one, it feels like a cycle that's just happening again. And characters don't really learn anything either, and if they do learn something, it's kind of undeserved. Especially Bob's side plot, who has to take care of Jack Jack in what's pretty much an extended version of Jack Jack Attack, a deleted sequence from the first Incredibles. Bob has to take care of his family alone, and the movie acts like he's never taken care of his family ever in all his existence. And then he gets so tired of taking care of Jack Jack that he gives Jack Jack to Edna Mode, who is in the movie for no reason, and then eventually he gets so tired still that he takes a nap, and then his kids feel bad because they've been treating him pretty bad too, and they're like, "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry." And then eventually they all make up and they're all happy again. It's like Dash and Violet notice that they've been treating him bad, and they decide to treat him nicer, and that's their arc.
The other watch after Jack Jack.
But I thought we were gonna go.
You heard your mother!
I go perimeter!
I'm not going anywhere! This is an imaginary creep! What about the kids? Jack Jack! Who's gonna...
Mom! Go. We've got this. I should stay here with Jack Jack.
That's my girl.
There is nothing in the movie that shows us her growth as a person, and like Houston said, Dash does nothing throughout the entire movie. Mr. Incredible's Incredicar is also in the film, because I guess Bird couldn't figure out a way to get the kids to the yacht at the end of the film, so it's just kind of mentioned and then appears. Another thing that just happens is the Underminer, who escapes from the film, and is never heard from again. Brad Bird himself answered on Twitter that sometimes, the bad guys just win and just get away. And I get that, it's kind of realistic, but the Underminer felt like extraneous information. He never tied back to the plot as well. I was talking to a friend called Eric at college, and he suggested that it would have been better if the Underminer robbed the bank because Screenslaver told him to, thus tying the Underminer back to the main plot, and he could have even returned at the end of the film to yet again have a rematch with the Incredibles, now working cohesively as a unit. It also makes more sense since the Underminer appears stating that he's waging war on the surface world. So how do you do that? Not by robbing a bank, but by robbing a bank, which leads to hatred towards supers, which leads to them getting outlawed, which is Screenslaver's plan, and eventually the Underminer could rise up against the surface with no one to stop him.
Then we come to Bob and Helen, who are so baffling in their choices that I don't even know what to say. Remember that scene we watched when Helen had that argument with Bob and told him he needed to stop reliving the glory days by doing hero work and learn to be a team with his family and be present? That was a really good scene, right? Well, in this movie, Helen does exactly what Bob did in the first film. She makes a deal with an evil corporation, ditches her family, and goes out to try and relive the glory days by doing hero work. And the weirdest part? The film barely addresses the fact that this is hypocritical. Helen does mention it in one line, but the script never actually addresses whether it was wrong of her to do what Bob did. It really seems like we're supposed to view her heroic adventures as empowering and #feminism and think, wow, isn't it great that a woman is having adventures all on her own? I wouldn't even have a problem with Helen making the same mistakes that Bob did if the movie actually addressed this and had them confront each other about it. But by the end, it's all abandoned for spectacle and comedy, and we're left thinking, wait, so Helen made the same mistakes as her husband, but it was okay for her to do that? Or was it not okay? The movie doesn't really specify, probably because they were afraid of giving any flaws or faults to a female role model. Bob is completely dumbed down and simplified as a character. Instead of a complicated man going through a midlife crisis and dealing with his legacy and abilities and how to balance fatherhood with herohood, he's basically just a grumbling dad who helps his kids with their math homework. Isn't it funny that he's doing dad things? Ha ha, he has to take care of the baby, ha ha. Pretty much 2/3 of Bob's involvement in this movie has no effect on the plot. All of the Jack Jack stuff is very entertaining, but it doesn't have anything to do with the movie on a thematic level, and if you cut it out, the story wouldn't change at all. Compare that to the first film, where almost every single scene has weight and impact on the story and characters. Another thing I love about the first Incredibles is that the conflict and problems in the movie largely arise from the hero's own mistakes, often because the Parr family is dysfunctional and won't communicate with each other properly. The obstacles and challenges and problems that the characters face in Incredibles 2 are almost never the result of their own actions or flaws. Remember in the first film how Syndrome only became a villain because Bob was rude to him, meaning Bob carried some of the blame? Remember how that made things more complex and dramatic? Yeah, not the case here. The villain Evelyn actually has very little connection to the Incredibles as people specifically, they're just the superheroes she targets because they're popular. Remember in the first movie when Bob is captured on Syndrome's island because Helen triggers his homing device to find out where he is? Remember how that only happened because he lied to her about where he was going in the first place? Yeah, in Incredibles 2, Helen is captured by a villain also, but It's got nothing to do with her own mistakes or internal flaws. The villain just kind of hit harder than she did.
Now, after watching The Incredibles 2, the first thing I was thinking was how to connect Evelyn Dever to Mr. Incredible or Elastigirl, because it felt like Evelyn Dever's hatred wasn't really towards them, it was more towards superheroes in general, and that means that the conflict really isn't personal, so it really isn't as gut-wrenching. What I was thinking is maybe have Mr. Incredible or Elastigirl be one of the superheroes that Evelyn Dever's father has available to call. Because you know Evelyn Dever's father died because he decided to call superheroes instead of calling the cops. So why not tie our heroes to this tragedy? It would be much more personal and much more impactful for Evelyn Dever's life to be personally impacted by a certain superhero we are following. And somehow, the movie just feels very shallow. And don't get me wrong, the movie isn't like a catastrophe, you know? The movie has hints of brilliance. The direction, the visuals, the cinematography, it's all great. But the thing is that the writing, it's not refined enough.
So the characters in Incredibles 2 are completely simplified and dumbed down from their complexity in the first movie. Dash is funny kid who runs fast. Violet is insecure teenage girl. Bob is grumbling dad. And Helen is girl power badass lady. But the other thing that Incredibles 2 dumbs down is the tone and maturity of the first film. It should be clear by now, but I love the first Incredibles for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that the film is a deconstruction and satire of classic superhero tropes. The universe the movie takes place in is a very low-key and subtle vision of what superheroes would be like if they lived in real life and had families of their own. It takes something seemingly shallow and simple and adds a more mature and complex, while still organically funny angle to it. Most of the more silly, comic booky elements of the first film, like Syndrome's Bond villain-esque hideout or the big killer robots or all the Golden Age stuff, play more like satirical wink and nod jokes and critiques of the "it's a bird, it's a plane" era of superhero serials. We start with seemingly simple and cliche bad guys and superhero action scenes, but then we get a look behind the action and discover that the heroes and villains are a lot more human than we thought. The movie also directly disputes the Saturday morning cartoon type of superhero action where death doesn't matter and the heroes always win. There's a scene where Helen directly tells her kids that the bad guys on the island aren't like cartoon bad guys. They will kill them if they get the chance. Scenes like that always stuck with me, because despite it being a family movie, Incredibles never shied away from life or death stakes, and it refused to dumb things down for kids. Whether Mr. Incredible was stopping a train or fighting a robot, he didn't feel invincible. And, you know, in retrospect, there's a lot of death and mortality in the first movie from beginning to end. A guy tries to commit suicide in the first 5 minutes, Bob watches a computer screen and slowly realizes that all of his former friends have been murdered, countless henchmen explode in their hover discs and fire machine guns at children, and Syndrome is ultimately sucked into a jet turbine and shredded, Raiders of the Lost Ark style. Now I ain't saying lots of death makes a good movie, but I always did appreciate that it seemed like there were stakes, and the people we were watching were human and vulnerable. By contrast, Incredibles 2 has almost no death or stakes whatsoever. The only deaths I could find in the movie are of Evelyn's parents in a flashback, which happens off screen and we have little connection with. 3 major action scenes in the movie are based around stopping a big thing from hitting another thing, even though it's unclear what the consequences of the thing hitting the thing will be. On paper, the events of this movie seem more large-scale in terms of action and locations and powers, but emotionally and dramatically, the movie kind of plays like a throwaway adventure where not much actually changes or happens. There's never a second in this film where you feel like people might die. There's no beat that captures the stress that the jet scene in Incredibles 1 does. There's no moment that has the weight of the one where Bob thinks his family has been killed, or when Helen thinks Bob is cheating on her. If the original Incredibles rejected the Saturday morning cartoon, Incredibles 2 completely embraces it. The first movie has stakes and death and adult themes. The second movie has cartoonish baby antics. These new superhero designs look more like Skylanders or Fortnite characters than actual believable people. How was the half-owl man supposed to have been living a normal life while superheroes were in hiding? He looks like an owl!
And that's a huge problem with The Incredibles 2. See, the first Incredibles, is very self-aware and self-referential. It's really like a parody of superheroes, comics, cartoons, pop culture. And then it takes all these elements and reconfigures them for the plot. Like Syndrome, for example, starts monologuing, and he becomes self-aware and he says,
"You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't believe it."
But The Incredibles 2, the sequel, is no longer a parody, a satire of the superhero genre. It is the superhero genre. It is a superhero film. It does a complete 180 on what makes the first film work. It forgets about, the two protagonists and their chemistry, the family dynamics and drama, and its villain, which ties back beautifully to our protagonist's past. Everything works because everything has a purpose, and nothing really feels just like unnecessary information that's just thrown in there just to have stuff in there. If you cut out everything that has no relevance to the plot in The Incredibles 2, so the political discussion, Bob taking care of his family, Jack's antics, you have basically a 1-hour movie. That's like a Saturday morning cartoon two-parter.
When I saw that Incredibles 2 was doing the mind-controlled heroes trope we've seen so many times before on Saturday morning cartoons, I thought it might be a satire or critique of that trope in the same smart vein as the first movie. But nope, it's just that cliche all over again, with no creativity or effort put into having something to say. I also just think there's a little too much cartoonish and over-the-top punchy spectacle action and flashy powers in this film. The final battle in the first Incredibles with the Pars and Frozone versus the Omnidroid lasts a solid 5 minutes, and that's perfect. The final battle in Incredibles 2 on the cruise ship lasts about 18 minutes, and you really feel that. In general, the first movie just has a much better build-up to the big action, where we start small and subtle and have lots of sleuthing around before we go all out. There's loads of stuff I could go on about, but we need to wrap things up here. Incredibles 2 is a movie where nobody makes real mistakes or has to face the consequences of their poor decisions. Everything about this movie is wrapped up in a simplistic, tight bow with no stone left unturned. Nobody learns or changes in any substantial or new way, except in the generic sense that, they worked as a team, which was kind of the point of the first movie. It's not a terrible film, it's not the worst of 2018, and if it weren't following up such a terrific original, maybe I wouldn't be this harsh. Either way though, it's a bad sequel, because it doesn't do anything except regress and simplify its characters and world, while sacrificing everything that made the original so good for cheap laughs. Now, Wreck-It Ralph 2 was a movie I was very much not anticipating. I adore the first Wreck-It Ralph, it's my favorite Disney movie, but from all the trailers, the sequel looked very pandering and shallow. To my surprise, however, Ralph Breaks the Internet is a very delightful sequel, one that does everything a good sequel should do. So with that, thanks for having me, and I'm gonna go take some cough medicine and let Browntable take over.
Natural progression is key for Ralph Breaks the Internet, something that can't be said for The Incredibles 2. And like Houston said, The Incredibles 2 really says nothing, and in the end, does nothing. It feels like an incredibly expensive OVA.
Meanwhile, Ralph Breaks the Internet introduces a new dilemma that grows naturally from where the characters left off. It's been 6 years since Wreck-It Ralph, and Ralph has now accepted himself, his career, and has conformed to his new life with Vanellope. It does what The Incredibles 2 should have done. Instead of blatantly pandering to fan nostalgia, Ralph Breaks the Internet not only showcases where the characters are now, but also fits in the elements of the first film to remind everyone that heck yes, this is a sequel to Wreck-It Ralph, but it's all non-gratuitous. Except for, the entire Disney segment. That really pissed me off as well. And it's great to be reunited with these characters that you haven't seen in years, and it's great to see where they are now. That's one thing that's always really fun about a sequel. You don't know where these characters are now years later, and it's really interesting to see where they end up, unlike The Incredibles 2, which starts an attosecond right after the first film. We see Ralph having drinks with Vanellope in this bar, and they're having root beer, and all these shots are beautifully framed with lighting behind these two characters. The movie can be really beautiful sometimes. And so the movie cements into our minds how great things are, so that when the film's conflict begins, and then the film ends, we see how drastically different everything ends up becoming. So the conflict at the beginning of the movie is that the wheel of the Sugar Rush game has been broken, and while it seems like that's the actual point of the movie, to prevent Sugar Rush's removal from the arcade in which all these characters live, this is a bit of a red herring, because the main conflict is that Vanellope longs for more than Sugar Rush, and wants to try new things. A story we can all relate to as people. Since we know her from the first movie, we understand her as well as her unpredictable nature. Ralph's conflict with Vanellope reminded me of the end of high school, at least for me. My friends were going to different places for college and nothing was ever going to be the same, and it makes you want everyone to stay together, and in the end, you end up becoming a little selfish. And that's what Ralph Breaks the Internet is about, moving on and letting things grow and change.
Well, that's right, you big baby. And these are for you. Heart, 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 heart.
Insecurity is a driving theme in the film, but it's more of an antagonist in the film and a catalyst for the true message the film is trying to convey. Things change, dynamics change, but we have to accept that bonds can be severed. I mean, if those bonds really mean that much to you, they'll never truly break. And all of this feels like a natural extension of the first movie. Like stated before, the worst thing a movie can do is regress a character's personal progression to fit the story. That's not how things should work. It's sloppy and weird. Remember in The Amazing Spider-Man where the film ends with Peter and Gwen breaking up to only get back together? And then its sequel starts with them together, only to have them break up in the first 20 minutes? Sloppy. But Ralph Breaks the Internet doesn't really do that. Sure, it may not be as amazing as the first, but it's nowhere near bad. It's still a fantastic film in its own right. Even supplementary fluff like Sergeant Calhoun and Fix-It Felix having to become parents and taking care of the nasty girls from Sugar Rush is fantastic. The side plot knows its place, and it's only there to clue the audience in on what's happening to all these characters that could lose their game. And in the end, every single character grows naturally. Felix and Calhoun learn to be parents, and the girls end up becoming nicer, unlike The Incredibles 2, which convinces itself that Bob's side plot is actually important to the overall plot, which it's not, and just slows the movie down. The film always works best when Ralph and Vanellope are together, and the fact that there are moments in the film in which there are multiple ways to achieve a goal is very similar to the internet, in which there are many ways to get the answer you're looking for.
To BuzzTube, it's this way.
No, we're going back to Spamley's. He can give us some easier loot to find.
No, we're supposed to see Shank's friend.
The internet in the film is also fantastically done, and it's a great change of pace from the slower world the main characters live in. The internet is something that these characters have never explored, and there's always a feeling of danger. What makes this so great is that the characters don't know this, and that leads to great situational comedy. Ralph Breaks the Internet also broke the never-ending Disney animated film's nice side character is actually the villain cliché. Even though in a way it still happened with Ralph becoming antagonistic, since we see it through Ralph's point of view, and we see him break down emotionally firsthand, then we understand why he's doing things, and we understand why he plants a virus in Vanellope's game. We're clued in to his feelings, his longing for acceptance, and his need to be happy. We really see that firsthand when he explores the BuzzTube comments section, which is very similar to the YouTube comments section, and he realizes that while a lot of people love him, plenty of people hate him as well. Even if the comments are just superficial, this hurts Ralph. And the next thing he says is that he's doing all the BuzzTube videos to get money for Vanellope's wheel, so she can go back to her game, Sugar Rush. So when he finds out that Vanellope wants to stay in Slaughter Race, he decides to try and keep her with him, because the one thing that's kept him going is trying to leave him. The sequel also works because at the end of the film, the main conflict is an emotionally charged, personal one. It's one based around the two main characters of the film, unlike The Incredibles 2 in which the conflict is an external one. Everything always feels much more intense when the emotions of our protagonists are being played with. While The Incredibles 2 has a giant yacht speeding towards the city and the only way to stop it is to just stop it with powers, in Ralph Breaks the Internet, there's a giant Ralph virus destroying the internet, but the only way to stop it is to talk. And I think there's something really special about that. It's kind of like the tension building in Ratatouille, only for the climax to be this quiet moment. Did you know Brad Bird directed Ratatouille? And if you're thinking, hey, the first Incredibles had a giant robot and, you know, they stopped it with powers. Yeah, no, that wasn't the real ending. The real ending is when Syndrome captures Jack-Jack. That's an emotionally charged ending. Now, in Wreck-It Ralph, the real Ralph telling his gigantic insecurity to move on and let go is incredibly literal, but the fact that it's visually represented makes it all the more powerful. And again, this isn't to say the movie is flawless. When Ralph and Vanellope enter the internet, there's almost a bit of too much unnecessary zooming to ads and such, with the main characters going, Google? What's that? You know, that's not really its biggest problem though, because of course, how are you going to showcase the internet without having the actual internet in it? But the movie does get really frustrating when Vanellope arrives at the Disney section of the internet, and there's so many cameos, it's mind-bogglingly annoying. It's like product placement to the extreme, with so many characters being vomited at you, you don't have time to think, and with this scene, the Disney scene, coming right after a somewhat emotional one, it feels very heavy-handed and awkward. The princess cameos, though, are fantastic. I have no issues with it, they're genuinely great. So all in all, I think Ralph Breaks the Internet and The Incredibles 2 are good movies in their own right, but I think Ralph Breaks the Internet is the superior film because it's able to juggle new ideas and take characters into new directions that we haven't seen before, and it's all done seamlessly and naturally. So, I want to thank Houston from HoustonProductions1 for collaborating and coming on the video. He's a great guy, he's got awesome content, go check his channel out, link in the description, and I also want to thank our sponsor Squarespace. Can't click away now, I got you. The Great Squarespace Challenge of 2018 has a winner, and his name is Zaddy45, which has created this beautiful Squarespace website for you all to enjoy. I mean, seriously, go check it out. Look, it's Zack Snyder. Everything's Zack Snyder. Also, someone else who submitted his website is David Addison. Go check out his website. It's actually not what I was looking for, but it's awesome anyway. And this dude completely takes advantage of Squarespace's features. He's got amazing graphics. You can of course link your Instagram to your website as well. All that sexy social media, and lastly, even music. Yeah, baby. And I know, you've been living under a rock. I'm so sorry. You don't know what Squarespace is. Let me tell you. Squarespace makes amazing products to help people like you with creative ideas succeed. The platform empowers millions of people, from YouTubers to actual actors to entrepreneurs. And Squarespace is one of the easiest to use and most sexy website development tools out there. Wait, what's that? Oh, you weren't asking for what Squarespace is, you were asking for what it stands for? Well, that's easy. Squarespace stands for go to squarespace.com/Browntable, use the code Browntable to get 10% off your first purchase. That's actually what it stands for. I'm 100% serious. And 100% serious again, I genuinely enjoyed using Squarespace. It was a fun time to actually make my website, add photos, add the videos. There's a new Catwoman sermon, by the way. Everything is just fun and fantastic, and I love using it. So thanks Squarespace for being our sponsor. Thank you Houston for coming on, and thank you for watching the video. Thanks for coming to the table, and I'll see you all next time. That was 4 thank yous.